Abrir esse painel com uma pergunta. Você tem um jogo e não sabe como publicá-lo? Nesse bate-papo, dois veteranos da Autopublicação falam sobre os fundamentos do marketing, crowdfunding e distribuição. Vale lembrar que você pode enviar sua questão através do aplicativo Big Festival 2018. Para mediar esse painel, está aqui no nosso palco, quero que vocês recebam com muitos aplausos, Martina Santoro, da Okam Studio. Seja muito bem-vinda, Martina. Participa desse painel ainda, vamos aplaudir Dino Patti, da Jump Chip. Seja bem-vindo, Dino. E para finalizar, vamos receber com muitos aplausos e carinho Remo, da Campo Santo. Remo, da Campo Santo. Seja bem-vindo. Martina.
Well, thank you so much for having us here. It's amazing to see this festival grow so much each year. Like, it's because of you guys, so congratulations. You should be like clapping for yourselves. Really. And I hope you try and stop these guys the minute they are walking around the festival, because we only have 40 minutes for questions with them, and then we'll have like 10 more minutes to answer the questions online. So you better stop them. So well, would you guys like to introduce yourselves as you like, please?
Yeah. So hello. I'm Chris Remo. I was one of the members of Campo Santo, a team that was in San Francisco, and we made a game called Firewatch in 2016, which we self-published. Now I'm part of Valve, as is all of the rest of Campo Santo. That happened a few months ago, so no longer a self-publisher, I suppose. Technically we are. But so that's me. Before Firewatch, I've worked on a number of games as a game designer, writer, and composer. Things I did on Firewatch as well, as game design and composer and audio on that game. And I've just worked at Irrational Games, Double Fine Productions, a number of independent productions over the years. Been involved in a few Kickstarter campaigns, and been podcasting as sort of an independent podcaster for about a decade now. So that's me.
My name is Dino. I started working with games in 2003. I'm most famously known for founding Playdead, which I ran for 9.5 years with my partner called Arndt, where we created Limbo and Insight. I left that in 2016, just after Insight released, and since then I've been starting a studio in the UK called Jump Ship. Yeah, doing a game called Somerville. Yeah.
Okay, so what we are going to try and figure out today is what it means to self-publish. I have a small studio in Buenos Aires called Okam Studio, and we've been working on both paths, right? We work with publishers, and then we are now trying to self-publish, so I really have a lot of questions for you guys. It's a really tough decision that you guys need to have as much information as possible. And really understand what it means to really tough decision that you guys need to have as much information as possible, and really understand what it means to go in one of these ways. So the first question for you guys is like, why did you decide on the first moment that you wanted to self-publish and not work with a third party?
So we worked with a third party, but only for funding. We handled all of the publishing duties, which include, marketing, production, community, localization, all of the things that a publisher provides. We did that in-house, and when the game was being pitched around, basically, every different kind of deal under the sun was considered, but ultimately, and some of them, were to preserve our creative control over the game and be able to be sure that we could treat the game and the whole development cycle the way that we wanted to. We kind of split up the duties. We didn't really think of it as publishing, I guess, because we were doing all of the roles of publishing within our own development team. So we didn't have any dedicated publishing or marketing people. We kind of just applied, I think, a lot of the same skills that we used in game development to those publishing challenges. And ultimately, for a lot of reasons, again, a lot of it having to do with creative freedom and I think also flexibility, we decided that was the best choice for us on Firewatch.
So our choice, I think, came early because we were. Super scared that people would change the concept and ruin the idea. So we talked to a lot of publishers in the beginning, and most of them wanted the IP, and that's why we chose to get go the funding route or the investment route instead. So we sold part of the company to some investors to get the money. And because we took that early choice of not having investors in, we just ended up doing it ourselves. And afterwards, we found out it was really smart. I think still, if you have that capacity and if you can do it yourself, and you have the lust and the team, people on the team to do it, I think it's really good. Especially because I think the press would rather talk to you guys than they would talk to a PR rep.
Yeah, I before I was in game development, about I guess this was over a decade ago now, I was in the press. I was a game journalist, and I definitely, that is completely accurate what Dino says. If you're a journalist, it's like miserable every day, all day, to get just infinite kind of press releases that all look the same, and offers to talk to a producer or a marketing person or whatever, and it's the worst. I mean, it's not interesting. And if the game isn't a really, really big, AAA game, you're just not gonna want to do that as a journalist because it's not interesting to you, and therefore it's probably not going to be interesting to your audience either. So yeah, that's very accurate. And also, I think it's not even. I think it's more important to have a smaller number of good relationships with press than it is to have kind of shotgun coverage of the whole kind of press scene, because we were talking about this last night, and we were observing that if the biggest outlets, it doesn't even have to be the biggest, but if a few decent outlets cover your game, the other ones will follow. And again, having been a journalist before, part of that is just practical. Like, any one journalist doesn't have the time to follow up every single story. There's just way too many games out there. If you see that something is getting covered somewhere else, you're gonna do that, kind of. It's just sort of easier that way. So I think a lot of what you get from sort of the kinds of press interactions that a traditional publisher uses, really big, broad, sweeping strategies that might be necessary, which might be necessary for the absolute biggest games out there, but it's probably not necessary for your independent game, which really it's much more important, again, to have a smaller number of those good relationships with journalists, because then they will want to actually champion your product, your game, and your product.
So you guys have actually different strategies when you were launching your games. You mentioned, Dino, that you went to an agency, for example, to complement your skills. But then you, Chris, told me that everything was done inside, and you were actually fulfilling different jobs inside of the same team. So how did you set up those strategies for your games? What do you think?
So in our case, because we're self-publishing, we knew we were going to we knew we had to take it seriously. And we knew also that if you go to a publisher, so a lot of them actually are so small that they also hire external PR reps So we just cut out the middleman and went to a PR agency who did a lot of games. We still made the strategy. We still decided on how to do it because we wanted this authentic experience for everybody. Something you'll see when you see Limbo and follow the coverage. There's like a straight line from the first thing that was released until the game. There's no thing that was like better than the game or like worse. It was like a teaser and it all led into the game, and that's a clear choice from our side to do that. But I think it's a good idea to use a PR rep because if you can do it yourself, I think, but it's so nice to have people who knows the press. They change jobs constantly and they become game lists, which is relevant right now because next year they're doing something else for new outlets or so on. So in that case, I think it was really helpful for us.
I think that makes a lot of sense, and I think that's probably a good route for a lot of people. I mean, we did it in-house, I think, because we were pretty confident that we had, I guess, the just sort of specific skills, and we were in the right place. I mean, we were in San Francisco, which is where a lot of the press is located. So, you know, our writer, Sean Vanneman, he would generally write, you know, a press release or an announcement or whatever, and then I'm sort of an editor by nature, and I would edit that material, and we would really like treat it like we were writing actual game material in the sense that we'd put it through all that same creative process. And I think you could still apply skills like that even working with an external partner because you want to bring something that feels authentic to you and your studio. Like one of the things that I think was really helpful to us is we managed a lot of, well, not all, I mean, not all of, we managed all of our own sort of community messaging, and, you know, we were constantly answering questions if people messaged us on Facebook or Twitter or whatever. We made sure that there were always usually like at least two people in the studio who were super aware of all of the places that we were on the internet that people might be trying to get in contact with us, and we would sort of bounce responses around inside the studio sometimes if there was sort of a tricky question someone had or something that required more careful language. And I think that stuff is important not because it's going to directly like multiply your sales, you know, like the number of people you're individually going to reach on social media is not that high, hopefully, compared like multiply your sales, you know, like the number of people you're individually going to reach on social media is not that high, hopefully, compared to what your game ends up selling if your game sells pretty well. But it's incredibly valuable to sort of plant a flag in terms of how your studio, I think this was important, how your studio communicates with the outside world, and it helps, it's almost like a muscle that you're exercising, and you are internalizing, you are learning how to communicate with the public and what the voice of your team is. You know, I think by the time we were ready to launch Firewatch, I think we had developed a really strong voice of our studio that people who cared about our studio and were looking forward to our game, I think they identified that voice and liked it and sort of wanted us to succeed. And I think it's because for the years leading up to development, we were constantly exercising those muscles and constantly just of her working. And, you know, a couple hundred people watched it. Again, very small number compared to hopefully the sales of the game. But it really, like, she liked doing it. The people who watched really liked her and really liked her watching her. And it was like practice. How are we communicating with the public? How are we, like, what is the way that we put ourselves out there? And it's sort of, you develop a voice. And then anytime you need to do something bigger, anytime you need to actually put out that press release, anytime you need to go to an event or put on an event or do something that's hopefully going to have wider reach, you understand what your voice is, and you've had practice communicating with people and developing what the feeling of your studio is. And it's hard to measure the effectiveness of that with numbers, but I strongly believe it was really helpful for us.
Something we were also discussing yesterday is like this difference between, you know, building a community, talking to the people that is going to be discussing yesterday is like this difference between, you know, building a community, talking to the people that is going to be finally your player, You were talking about talking to the press. It's really different kind of information that you need to send them, but also you have to create the bond, right? You were saying about like, well, maybe you have to choose people and try to have a relationship. But you were also mentioning that there is like another group of people that is what maybe in YouTube is like an influencer, but then it's in a different level, like the people that you trust inside the industry. You mentioned you work in Double Fine, and you got to work with all these great influencers for the development industry. Now, it's not that they are YouTubers or anything, but every time, I don't know, Tim Schafer tweets something, everybody gets to know about that. So what is for you the role of someone that...
There's your colleagues, and then there's sort of influencers, and those are pretty different groups. We with influencers, we did something where we actually, when we were getting ready to launch our game, we actually made a special build of the game that only included, I think, the first 2 days. So Firewatch is the game we made. Firewatch is split up into days. So it's like there's a prologue, then day 1, day 2, day 3, day 9, day 33, just 15, and there's all these different days. And so we made a special build of the game that only had days 1 and 2, and we sent it to a bunch of YouTubers who seemed like they would, appreciate the kind of game it was, and had decent subscriber counts and things like that. And we gave this to them a week before the game came out. And so if you know Firewatch, if you know our game, it's a single-player game. Most people are probably only going to play through it once or maybe twice. Most people are probably only going to play through it once or maybe twice. So it's not the kind of game you think of as like a streaming game. It's not like no one's playing Firewatch on Twitch now. Like they played it 2 years ago when it came out. And so this was a way that we could actually make our games seem like special and cool to these streamers because they were getting it early, but because it was a story-based game, we didn't want them to be able to like spoil the whole game for their their audience. That would ruin the game for everyone else who was really looking forward to it. And so we didn't include the introduction to the game, which we considered a spoiler, and we didn't include anything after day 2. And so this was a really cool way that even though our game isn't really like a streaming friendly game, I mean, it is streaming friendly, but it's not the kind of game that's going to be streamed for years. This was a way to still get streamers excited about the game. And I think that's exact way to still get streamers excited about the game. And I think that's exact thing might not be right for everyone's game, but I think it speaks to an important skill that I think you have to develop if you're going to self-publish your game, which is you need to constantly be thinking about things like that. That cost us almost no money. That was basically free. That was like, a few hours of a programmer's time to make that build. Not a big expenditure, but I think it really paid off. The way I always think about when you're putting stuff out there to the public is like, think about everything you put out into the world. Think about it almost like a game design problem where you have to think about it from the perspective of the people on the other side. Like, they don't know what your game is. They probably don't care about you, really. Like, and I'm not saying you, that was us too. Like, no one on the internet cares about anything. Like, unless you give them a reason to. Whenever you put any message out there, any materials out there, you cannot assume that anyone already cares, already has knowledge. You always have to think about it like the same exact way you think about game design, which is like, how are the people who perceive this going to react to it, and what are they going to think about it? And we tried to think about all of our marketing that way as well, in addition to developing the game, and that's where we came up with ideas like that streaming build. I mean, maybe someone else already did that, and we got the idea from them, I don't remember.
The role that you had inside your company, you were kind of like the guy that was doing like the networking for the whole team, right? Besides the agency, yes. Right? You have like the social skills.
Yes, exactly.
Can you tell us about that role inside the team?
Yeah, this is just one of the things I did, but I think it's super important because we could get whichever contacts we needed because I was out and meeting people, but I don't know. I think for final marketing, I think we just let the game speak for itself. It wasn't because of contacts. I didn't get to say before, but one of our things we did was like a preview on the game, where we told our PR company that they should get 10 of the top outlets, and this we should get a journalist which they thought would like this type of game. So a guy who liked indie games, or a guy who liked puzzle games, or whatever. And they just handled that, and we did that at GDC, where everybody is. So we got 10 meetings with 10 people, and we decided. So they came down, and it felt like came down in a basement. It wasn't. It was like on the 10th floor, but they came from the 11th floor down to this dark room, and they got 15 minutes of Limbo, and it was super awesome, and everybody loved it. And they had a blast, and we didn't do any show and tell. We didn't explain anything. Just set them in front of a computer and let them play it. That's also like it cost us a bit more than just doing the trailer thing, but it wasn't that expensive. And for us, the PR company handled all the if there was cancellation, if there was changes in time, we were just sat there and welcome people and talk very little about the game because most of the game talked. It spoke for itself, which I also think is important for games.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, it's like you can hype your games so much, but in the end, it has to stand for itself. We can't remember what we called it, but you need to do a test internally in company where you put a person in the sofa and gives them the. You need to do a test internally in company where you put a person in the sofa and gives them the controller, and they cannot have any help starting the game, and that should work. It doesn't work if you stand behind them and say, oh, you need this, and this is a better strategy, and do this instead. But maybe that's another aspect, I don't know.
And well, for example, I was telling you guys yesterday, when we started working in Okam, we started doing advertising. So when we wanted to do, advert games and shit like that. But when we wanted to go into serious games and start working on our own IPs, part of the work we did was, of course, having a prototype, something to share. But then we started to come to these events. We started to walk the halls, trying to meet other developers. And then we actually started to help a lot with the organization of events like this. We had to spend more time and to actually show you the game and just create this bond that when we decided to make a Kickstarter campaign, it really paid off. We didn't do it on purpose, but when we launched the Kickstarter, we didn't have many people following us, but then Tim Schafer or Ron Gilbert, Robin Haneke, they started to just retweet something, and we suddenly were in a place we weren't expecting. We were being reviewed by international press. A lot of people, I know the guys from Capybara, the reference for the industry at least, kind of put us on a different level. So when we wanted to, when we later got to fund the Kickstarter, we actually got the attention of a lot of investors and publishers that maybe before wouldn't invest on us. But then now they thought well, now you have a community, now you have the support of your colleagues. It's people that actually trust you and they're vouching of your colleagues. It's people that actually trust you and they're vouching for you. Did this happen to you? Did you have?
Yeah, I think a really big part, and this is tough because you can't guarantee this kind of thing happens, but I think something that is pretty important in making your game a success is making it feel like it's inevitable that your game will be a success. So much of games and the way people talk about games on the internet especially has to do with kind of silly things like hype and sort of momentum and just what people are talking about, and creating the impression that your game is sort of, I don't want to say more than it is, it's not being dishonest, but you almost have to act bigger, than you necessarily feel all the time. Firewatch, I think in retrospect, it's oh, well, Firewatch sold pretty well and it did pretty well. In retrospect, it's oh, well, Firewatch sold pretty well and it did pretty well and it's a great game and good job. But we didn't think that at all when we were making it. We didn't we thought it would be good. We thought it would be a good game or we wouldn't have been making it. But we didn't think there was anything automatically amazing about it, or like that, you know, we didn't know if people were going to buy it, but you almost have to, like, regardless of what is in your own brain, you kind of have to act like it's inevitable that this thing is really good and great and big. Otherwise, there's just so many other games out there. Like, you want people to pay attention to your game, and it needs to grab people immediately. Like, you know, obviously part of the inevitability in your case was like, oh, all these famous people are tweeting about this, it must be a real thing. But they probably wouldn't have done that unless there was something about it that they could immediately grab to sort of make a great first impression, because if there isn't something immediately interesting or unique about your game, again, there are infinite other games that people can pay attention to. There's just millions of them. There needs to be something about your game that is obvious. That sounds stupid, but I think Limbo and Firewatch are actually pretty good examples of this. Like, you look at Limbo, now a lot of games look like Limbo, but when Limbo came out, nothing looked like Limbo. Like, that game was immediately, even before you know what the gameplay is, before you know anything about it, like, you know that there's something unique about that game. I don't think Firewatch is quite as extreme as Limbo in that regard, but we chose the art that we used when we announced the game, like, really, really, really carefully. And we really wanted it to be very striking and for people to notice it immediately, and don't like used when we announced the game, like, really, really, really carefully. And we really wanted it to be very striking and for people to notice it immediately, and don't like picking screenshots, even something like that. That's a skill that you have to take really seriously. Like, we agonized over what screenshots we would release. Like, we did not just like go in there and take some screenshots. Like, we spent a long time making sure that the screenshots we were picking were representing the game at its absolute best, and like had different color schemes. I mean, obviously that doesn't apply to your game, but like, you know, in our game, part of the appeal is that it's this outdoor natural environment, and there's all these different kinds of environments and types of nature, and we really, really wanted that to come through. Like, we took that really, really seriously, and you have to figure out what is the thing about your game that is totally unique and immediately grabs people, and just make it really us. You know, there are parts of our game that I think are really cool that you can't really show in the screenshot very easily. So like, you have to pick the things that you can show really easily, and then find other ways to communicate the more complex things, like once people already care. You know, like we released longer trailers later, you know, that show more of the sort of story and dialogue. But the initial announcement was just kind of like more mysterious, more leaning on the visuals. You know, you have to just bear in mind that like people don't already know anything about your game, so you need to make it really obvious when you're showing them. Anyway, I went on way too long. Sorry about that.
I think you're definitely right about that. I would just say that the bar for games has always been really high, and it rises every year because the techniques get better, the tools get better. So if you want to do a successful game, you actually have to look at as having something unique that can compete with something in there. It doesn't need to be like AAA or something, but there's a lot of indie games in there also, like The Last Night and so on. But it has something that draws you in, so it gets a place in that Hall of Fame, or what you can call it. So it's so important because there's so many games. I think it's 30 games a day released on Steam at the moment.
Yeah, it's like 30.
It's 30 games, so it's you really need to show your screenshots, but also like from the core, when you develop the game, find out how you can do something that's unique to your game and nothing else.
Yeah, and those things can be kind of weird. Here's a funny thing from Firewatch. I think it's kind of weird. You know, our game doesn't have people in it that you can see. There are a couple parts of the game that have sort of, you can see kind of shadows of people, but we didn't have the budget to animate like full people, rigged animated people walking around. Like, that just wasn't, we knew we weren't going to do that from the beginning. But our animator, Jay Benson, he is like a thing he's a great animator generally, but a thing he's really good at, and a thing he just has a good mind for is like first-person animations. So almost all of our animation budget, we had one animator, and pretty much all of his time went into like first-person body awareness. This is something that even a lot of AAA games do not do like at all. Like a lot of really games that cost $100 million, often you're just kind of a floating camera, or you're kind of just these like crappy legs, whatever. And that's nothing against those games. Like those games have other amazing things in them. But this was something where we, I think in a way, sort of turned our budgetary constraints into an advantage, because we were able to put his skills to making the feeling of being this character, I think, pretty complete. Like you can look down and see his body, and when he picks things up, you see his hand, and when he interacts with something, it's this beautiful animation, and he moves it around, and when he looks up at the sun, he kind of like puts his hand up, and he moves under a board, and it's none of that is necessary to make the game we made. We could have made the exact same game without that component, and it would have been pretty much the same game, but obviously not actually. Like that added something really unique and specific to Firewatch that could be communicated really easily. Like here's the thing about putting stuff like that in a trailer. The trailer doesn't say, hey, they didn't have budget for other people, that's why there's no people in the trailer. No, the trailer just sells it as like it's mysterious and like you're alone and what's going on, you turn that into an advantage. And what they do see is like this amazing animation, and it's like, wow, this game has incredible animation, even though it doesn't have very much animation in it. Like you can show off the part that is actually totally unique, that I do think is like that element is better than a lot of games that were much more expensive than our game. And we I think turned that disadvantage into an advantage, and that's the kind of thing you have to find things like that, and then put them right out there so people can see them immediately. And when you're doing all the marketing yourselves, you have to be thinking about everything in your game from that standpoint. It doesn't mean you should make your game because of your market game yourself and sell it yourself. You have to be thinking about how you're actually going to do that, or you're not going to get to make another game.
You guys mentioned Steam as a platform where you have 20 games every day that are new. When you go to mobile, you'll find, 100, but then in consoles it's different. You'll have like much less, still a lot of games. You were mentioning yesterday the difference about going to these platforms. It's like you are maybe saving some part of your budget for development to hire a marketing agency, or you are thinking about this special content. But what do you think could be a good advice about in which order you are arriving to these platforms, or how do you connect with the people that actually help you stand out on Steam, for example?
So I have this theory, and it's maybe just a theory, but if you look at the mobile platforms, there's 200 games coming out a day. If you look at Steam, there's 30 games a day. If you look at the consoles, it's maybe only one a day, 2 a day, or something. So getting into, we always preferred to do a console launch with a PC launch, just to make it feel more like, I feel people put more value into a console game, even though it's like almost the same. Obviously it requires a bit more in terms of compliance, but I see it as I have this, I think I said yesterday, I see it as like the OL, or the Olympics. So if you're in the Olympics and if you're unknown, you kind of get covered because you did something great to get into the Olympics. So if you're unknown, I think doing an Xbox game, I think because the nature of their Queen List games, it's easier to get some press around that. If you go to there's a lot of outlets who just covers Xbox games or PlayStation games. So yeah, that's my small theory.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. We had a slightly different, I think, outlook on it, which we were, we went PC first from the beginning, and because I guess because the position we were in, we knew that was the platform that we could ship on no matter what. You know, we didn't really necessarily know what our console strategy was going to be or if that was going to work. So we pretty strongly, you know, had PC first development, and then when it was, you know, quite a ways into development when we started talking to console, and then when it was, you know, quite a ways into development when we started talking to console platforms, and we basically, I think because we had enough of the game, you know, sort of on PC and people excited about it by that point, it put us in a pretty lucky position where we were able to sort of talk to both Microsoft and Sony, which for our game were the platforms that we thought made the most sense, and sort of work with the one who gave us the best deal, honestly, and the ones we kind of liked working with the most. When we, honestly, it worked pretty well for us. I can't say that would be the same for every game. I think the style of game we were making, I think, made sense on PC. You know, I mean, it makes sense on consoles equally, but like, certainly, I think this kind of first-person storytelling game is something that there's a big vocabulary for in the PC gaming audience. Indie gamers, I think, sort of understand basically that that format. So it made sense for us. And then when we started working on our second game, In the Valley of Gods, which we're working on now, we were doing the same thing. We started with PC, and we haven't even started thinking about our consoles yet, to be honest. But I think it really depends on your game and your team. I think there are certainly some genres of game that just make a lot more sense on a console, and it doesn't, you know, you should be thinking about that as well. But like every single other thing we're talking about, it really has to make the most sense for your game and your team.
Yeah, I see this bit as a budget restraint, because I feel that if you could release on Xbox and PC and PlayStation at the same time, that would always be the best for a game. But it also costs most, and it's really, really difficult to do many releases at the time.
Yeah, that's a big, and it requires a lot of engineering bandwidth.
Before we go to the questions of the audience, like what kind of last piece of advice can you share? So we've been talking about doing like all this research, right? You have to do the homework. What does it mean to launch on Xbox and in a special territory, maybe Peggy, I don't know, you know, you have like all these other concerns that when you're making a game, you're just not thinking about. Do you have any advice on that, or anything that you want?
I mean, that's a lot. I mean, there's a lot of things you have to remember. If you're going to be self-publishing your game, it means you're not going to have someone who knows kind of all the steps there, sort of sketching everything out for you and keeping you on track. So you really need to have a plan. I mean, it doesn't mean you need every day mapped out, obviously, that's impossible, but you need to know the categories of things that you need to do, and you need to be thinking about those things so that you don't start them too late. Like, if you're not thinking about localization from pretty early in the game, especially if like in our game is super duper dialogue heavy. Our game is just packed with, you know, thousands and thousands of lines of dialogue, and so if your game is like that and you're not thinking about localization from the beginning, you are going to be miserable at the end of it. I mean, we were thinking about it relatively early on, and it was still a totally crazy process. I don't think, you know, we were not, I don't think, fully prepared for how much effort things like localization and QA would take, you know, never having done those things ourselves before. Those were really intense processes, and you'll do yourselves a lot of favors if you are constantly talking to people long before you're at the point where those things have to get done. Like, you should be just talking to other people who have gone through this process or who are in the middle of these processes. Just talk to as many different people as you can with as many different kinds of teams and games as you can, and just make sure that all of the goals you have for the end of the project, you're thinking about them from the beginning so that you don't get caught by surprise at the end.
I would say think globally from the beginning. Don't think like you can sell in a local region, but games, they can be downloaded all over the world, so think localization, but also think globally in terms of marketing, in terms of all like whatever you do in the game. Don't think this is something you're going to sell here in a store. That's one thing. The other thing was, now we're here and we are talking for self-publishing. I'm a bit sad we don't have a person talking for publishing, because there's probably also some good things with that.
If you are going to work with a publisher, then what would be a piece of advice? Like, what should they be especially taking attention to?
So this is a huge topic, but don't take a shitty deal. Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of, I mean, like, the biggest thing to say is that, right? Like, you kind of don't say yes to the shitty deal. Like, I was reading a stat, sounds unrelated, but I was reading recently that people who are buying a home for the first time, not that I've ever bought a home or can see that happening anytime soon, but, people who are buying a home for the first time apparently, on average, overpay for they're willing to pay more than someone who has sold their home and is buying a new home later or is older, and it's because, not having gone through it before, they don't understand that the deal that they're being offered is maybe not as good as they think it is. They sort of have this more naive approach, and I think the same thing is true with a publishing deal. Like, when you are going from having zero money to someone offering you theoretically a bunch of money, almost any deal that's put in front of you can look great because suddenly there's money there. But don't assume that just because it's being offered that it's actually good. Like, talk to people again, like, think really, really carefully about what you're committing to before you commit to anything.
I also say that because I've been helping a lot of Danish companies, and we also, with my new company, been out and pitching the game to publishers. And a lot of time they are ridiculously shitty, the deals, because they think people get if you're inexperienced, just talking to a publisher and presenting and making a deal makes you feel that you need to sign it, and it would be, but sometimes they actually don't offer you anything, and they want half of your income, or like, but sometimes they don't offer you anything. Sometimes it's just they offer some marketing if and when and so on. So it's watch out for your deals. So we use the time.
Okay, so I don't know if you want to start with the questions from.
Ok. Temos algumas perguntas que foram nos enviadas para o aplicativo Big Festival 2018. O Danilo vai ler a primeira pergunta. Danilo, por gentileza.
English. Oh, you stressed me out. This first question is not addressed, so feel free to choose who you answer it. How viable is it for a team to self-publish their first project?
I don't know, because I had worked on several games in different environments before we were in this position. I mean, to be honest with you, I don't know that I believe we could have succeeded to the degree we did with Firewatch if pretty much all of us on the team didn't come from having worked on other projects. You know, some of those projects were successful and some of them weren't. It's not like all of us had just only worked on hits or anything, but we'd all gone through the process multiple times before of taking a game from, conception to shipping in different roles, and there was a lot of discipline required to do that. I mean, one of the things that I think about a lot as a designer is scope. So, I'm constantly trying to think about, don't overscope, don't like, always, it's okay to cut things, just make sure you're cutting the right things. And I don't know that I would have fully understood the value of a lot of those sort of skills and disciplines if I had not gone through game development before in a more traditional setting. I know there are definitely people who, self-publish their game or make their own game, like write when they're young or whatever, and their first project, and that's great, and that's definitely possible now. You know, I mean, you can do that now in a way that was not possible 15 years ago. But you know, you just have to just have to understand that the chances of that working are going to be lower than if you go into that process with a bit more understanding of what you're getting into. It's kind of a depressing answer.
So my short answer is almost what you said, but like it comes down to the capacity of your team. If you have the capacity internally, as you said, like you could write and so on, and you have people who likes marketing, do it. If you only have one game designer and a coder, maybe it's the right thing to have a publisher.
Next question is, how do you build a community for a game before the game releases, or even before the game is ready or playable? How much help are festivals like Big versus social media?
It's an easy answer for me because we never built a community, probably, which is also a sad answer.
Yeah, I mean, you know, there you go, right? Like that game was successful and didn't need any of the stuff that I was talking about in terms of me. So it's really hard this is always the problem with talking to people whose projects were a success, is it's like we don't necessarily know which decisions we made were the ones that resulted in success. So, you know, I look at community building and it's something that I feel is important, but like, I don't know if it's important. I only know that it seemed to work for us. I think that one of the things that, I'm going to answer this question a little bit differently actually than it was asked, because I think this is just something that's really important. For me, when I think about what community building means to me, it goes back to like the very beginning of my career in games, which is like 2004, I guess. Some of the same people that I were part of like my personal kind of online game community back in 2004, I'm still working with some of them. One of those guys literally like co-founded Campo Santo, and I've worked with him on different projects for 15 years now. And when we became friends, neither of us were professional game developers or really game developers at all. You know, we were just kind of idiots who knew each other on the internet. And and that's just one example, but I mean, a bunch of people I work with now or have worked with at various points are people who I've just built those relationships with for many, many years. And like, to me, that was actually the community that is the most important one to build, because we all understand each other's kind of skills and talents and capacities in a way that would be really difficult. Like I always have this like fear of having to go out and just like find a new job just based on sending resumes, which I know is a thing that a lot of people obviously have to do. But like, I mean, I have done that in the past, but now I'm kind of lucky to have built so many of these relationships going back a decade and a half, that there are people out there who sort of understand what I do in a way that is a lot more significant than if I just had to like flatly explain myself to someone who has no idea who I am. And that's not because I'm like well known or anything, it's because I've literally been working with a bunch of these people since no one knew who any of us were. I think that's just I have found in my career, and this might not be true for everyone, but I have definitely found that maintaining those relationships with people you respect and who respect you is like the best long-term investment you can make in your ability to ultimately work on projects that you're interested in.
The next question is for Dino. How different it was publishing Limbo from publishing Inside? Did you feel easier to publish Inside when you already had a game such as Limbo published, or it was hard or difficult as the first?
So we treated Limbo and Inside the same way. I think I had this theory about the reason why sequels always get shitty is because you try to rely on your past success, and we tried not to do that. We tried to work hard to do as good a job the second time as the first time. And you know, before we launched, you never know obviously if it's going to sell. I knew it was a good game. I really I felt it was a good game. It still doesn't guarantee they will sell when it comes out, because there can be a lot of factors that makes it not sell. In terms of like the launch process, obviously we learned a lot, and we are a bigger team, so it was much more smooth to get on the consoles, and we had a bigger team, and we also used Unity the second time. The first time we used our own engine, which means we spent a lot of effort into coding our own engine to work on Xbox and PlayStation, all that. Where with Unity it was a bit easier. It wasn't as easy as they advertise. I would say it's maybe better now, but it was not like one-click publish. I promise you that. Yeah, I would say it felt like the same. That's a good answer.
We don't have too much time, but I'll ask you one more question to Dino again. How it was to work with the Xbox team? How did you feel when Limbo became an Xbox 360 exclusive? And the difference when Limbo was released from different platforms?
So we have a really good relationship with Microsoft, and I still have put the name on anything. So I really like that program. Yeah, and I just feel that when you have a game and it's good, it's always been worth it to just port it to whatever platform is out there. Like I think, like for me, it's also a business de-risk thing, that you build a game that can go on almost anything, and then it takes 2 years to make the game, and half year before you launch, you look at what's out there, and you try to make the game fit those platforms. So that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I appreciate it.
Tudo que é bom tem que acabar, né? Infelizmente. Quero agradecer a todos pela presença, em especial os nossos convidados. Vamos aplaudir Martina Santoro. Thank you, Martina. Dino Patti. Thank you. E por fim, Remo, da Campo Santo. Muito obrigado. Thank you. Lembrando que a programação do Big Festival 2018 segue o próximo painel Aventuras na Autopublicação.